What would you do if your own mother banned you from Thanksgiving, not because of a fight, but because your job wasn't good enough to impress a rich guest? The story begins with a simple phone call, one that quietly reshaped the way Thora saw her own family. It was a calm Sunday evening, and she was grading her students' essays like she always did when her phone suddenly rang. It was her mother. From the very first tone in her voice, Thora sensed something was wrong. The familiar mix of hesitation and cold control she had known for years. There was no small talk, no warmth. Her mother went straight to the point. "It might be better if you don't come to Thanksgiving this year." It wasn't because of an argument or any real conflict. It was because her sister Vivian was bringing her wealthy boyfriend home, and Thora's presence might be embarrassing. In their eyes, a school teacher with a modest salary didn't belong in front of someone from the elite world of finance. The words weren't brutally direct, but the meaning was unmistakable. Her career was a liability. Thora paused for a moment, not because she didn't understand, but because she understood too well. This wasn't the first time her family had made her feel like she didn't belong. For years, she had been placed second to Vivian, the successful, polished, admired daughter. And even though she had grown used to it, that didn't make it hurt any less. In that moment, she could have argued. She could have demanded respect. She could have defended her choices, but she didn't. Instead, she simply said, "I understand," and hung up. Two small words, carrying the weight of years of quiet endurance. She knew that in her family, a person's worth was measured by wealth and status, not by dedication or integrity. And she also knew that no explanation would change their minds. After the call, the silence in her apartment felt heavier than usual. She looked around at the small space she had built for herself, a place filled with books, lesson plans, and quiet effort that no one in her family had ever truly acknowledged. This was her life, honest and meaningful, yet to them it was something to hide. The pain wasn't just about missing a dinner, it was about being erased from her own family. Thanksgiving was supposed to be about belonging, but for her, it had become a symbol of exclusion. And in that quiet moment, something inside her began to shift. Not anger, not yet, but an emptiness. A hollow space where patience used to live. And sometimes that emptiness is exactly where change begins. Everyone saw Vivian as the successful daughter. But what if the disappointing one was the only person quietly holding everything together? After that cold phone call, the story begins to reveal more about who Thora really is and the role she truly plays in the Mitchell family. Thora Mitchell, 32 years old, is not a failure, as her family subtly implies. She is a dedicated history teacher who has spent over a decade in the classroom, educating and inspiring hundreds of students. Nothing about her journey was easy. She worked 2 jobs while pursuing her master's degree, paying her own way, and building her career step by step without meaningful financial support from her family. Yet none of that seems to matter to them. In the Mitchell family, success is measured by money, status, and the ability to impress others. And by those standards, Vivian, Thora's younger sister, always wins. Vivian works in marketing, moving in corporate circles, interacting with wealthy clients, and presenting herself with polished confidence. Their mother speaks of her with pride, using her as proof of the family's success. Meanwhile, when Thora is mentioned, the tone shifts, flat, brief, almost dismissive. She teaches. A simple phrase, but heavy with judgment. No one asks about her students, about the lives she's impacted, or about the effort she puts into her work every single day. They don't see the early mornings preparing lessons, or the late nights grading papers with care. They don't see the value because they aren't looking for it in the right place. Thora lives alone in a small but warm apartment filled with books, notes, and the quiet evidence of a meaningful life. It isn't glamorous, but it's real. Still, in her family's eyes, it represents failure. The comparison between the two sisters is never spoken outright, but it is always there in conversations, in tone, in silence. Vivian is the pride. Thora is the afterthought. What makes it more painful is that Thora isn't jealous. She genuinely wants her sister to be happy and her family to feel proud, even if that pride never includes her. But that acceptance has slowly pushed her further out of the family's center. She became the understanding one, the one who never complains, never causes trouble, always sacrifices to keep peace. And over time, that role became a trap. Her family grew used to taking her for granted. Always there, always quiet, always accommodating. They failed to see that behind her silence was a person with dignity limits and years of accumulated hurt. While Vivian was supported and elevated, Thora learned to stand on her own. And that difference would become crucial. Vivian may appear successful on the surface, but Thora is the one with true strength, resilience, discipline, and empathy. And even if her family cannot see it yet, the story is beginning to reveal a deeper truth. Real value is not always found in what is most visible. How many times can someone be overlooked before they stop trying to belong at all? What happened during that Thanksgiving phone call wasn't an isolated incident. It was simply the breaking point after years of unfair treatment within Thora's own family. Looking back, she could count dozens, even hundreds of moments where she had been overlooked, dismissed, or placed behind her younger sister. These moments were rarely loud or dramatic. Instead, they appeared as small details, the kind that quietly accumulate into the deepest wounds. She remembered birthdays where she received only a brief, indifferent message, while Vivian enjoyed elaborate surprise parties. She remembered family dinners where her achievements went unmentioned, while even the smallest updates in Vivian's life were praised and discussed at length. She remembered how her mother introduced them to others. "This is Thora, my older daughter," she teaches. And Vivian works in corporate marketing, the tone shifting from flat to proud within a single sentence. These differences were never accidental. They formed an unspoken system, a way her family assigned value between the two daughters. And over time, Thora came to understand that she was always on the lesser side of that equation. The pain wasn't just in the comparison, but in the fact that she was never truly seen for who she was. Even when she reached important milestones, earning her master's degree, becoming a department chair, her family barely reacted. There were no congratulations, no pride, just silence, as if her accomplishments didn't matter. Meanwhile, anything related to Vivian, a new project, a new relationship, became the center of attention. Thora learned to celebrate her achievements alone, to validate herself, because she knew that waiting for her family to do so would only lead to disappointment. But becoming used to something doesn't mean it stops hurting. Every time she was overlooked, she had to remind herself that she still had value, even if no one said it out loud. And over time, constantly having to prove that to herself became exhausting. She began to question whether she had been trying too hard to hold onto a place in a family that had never truly made space for her. The saddest part was that she never fought back, not because she was weak, but because she believed that if she were patient enough, good enough, things would eventually change. But year after year, the only thing that changed was how much she could endure. Her family grew used to her silence, used to her acceptance, and began to treat it as something guaranteed. They didn't realize that every time she said, "I understand," she was swallowing a piece of her own self-respect. And all those small, repeated moments built an undeniable truth. Thora wasn't just overlooked, she was misdefined. Yet from that pain, something else was beginning to grow, a realization that perhaps the problem wasn't that she wasn't enough, but that she had been in an environment that never knew how to value her. And once she saw that the question was no longer, "How do I earn acceptance?" but "Should I keep trying to earn it at all?" If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, type enough in the comments, because sometimes recognizing your limit is the first step toward changing everything. While the Mitchell family continued to see Thora as nothing more than an ordinary teacher living a lesser life, by their standards there was a completely different truth, quietly existing beneath the surface, a secret she had kept for 2 years. Not because she wanted to hide power, but because she wasn't ready to face it. That secret began with her grandmother, the only person in the family who had ever truly seen and valued her. Before she passed away, her grandmother had established a trust worth over $15 million, naming Vivian as the sole beneficiary. But the real significance wasn't the money, it was who controlled it. Not her parents. Not Vivian. Thora, the one they had always underestimated. Within the legal structure of the trust, Thora was appointed the sole trustee, giving her complete authority over when, how, and whether the money would ever reach Vivian. This wasn't symbolic power, it was absolute, protected by carefully constructed legal provisions. When Thora first learned about it, she didn't feel triumphant. She felt the weight of it. Power comes with responsibility, and in this case, that responsibility was tied directly to the same family that had hurt her for years. So she chose silence. She didn't tell her parents. She didn't tell Vivian. She didn't use it as leverage to demand respect. Partly because she didn't want money to define her relationships, and partly because she didn't yet know what to do with that power. But after the Thanksgiving call, after being excluded from her own family simply because her career wasn't impressive enough, her perspective began to shift. She no longer saw the secret as just a burden. She began to see it as a key, not for revenge, but for balance. When she reopened the email from her grandmother's attorney and carefully read through the clauses outlining her authority, she realized that for the first time in her life, she wasn't powerless in her family dynamic. She wasn't the one who had to accept everything just to belong. She was the one who could set conditions. What made this secret truly powerful wasn't just the money, it was the intention behind it. Her grandmother hadn't made this decision randomly. She had seen the difference between her granddaughters, one who had been given everything easily, and one who had learned to endure, and she believed only Thora had the fairness and strength to use that power wisely. She had once told Thora that Vivian wasn't a bad person, just someone who had never been forced to understand the value of what she had. The trust wasn't just an inheritance, it was a lesson, an opportunity for growth. But for that lesson to exist, Thora had to be willing to act. And that was the turning point. Thora began to question whether her silence was no longer kindness, but avoidance. If she continued to accept being invisible, was she betraying the trust her grandmother had placed in her? The secret was no longer just hidden information. It became a choice between continuing to endure or finally stepping into change. And for the first time in years, Thora no longer felt powerless. She had a voice, a position, and a form of power that no one in her family even suspected. But the real question wasn't whether she had power, it was whether she was ready to use it. And when someone who has been underestimated finally recognizes their own worth, everything around them can begin to shift in ways no one expects. After the truth about the trust began to settle in her mind, the first thing that changed wasn't Thora's actions, but the way she saw herself. For years, she had grown used to being placed second in her family, used to being the understanding one, used to staying silent to keep the peace. But now, knowing she held a kind of power, her family didn't even suspect, a question began to form. Had her silence truly been a choice? Or had it simply been a way to avoid confronting how unfairly she had been treated all along? She started replaying the small moments, the times she was overlooked, the subtle put-downs, the one-sided expectations she always fulfilled before she had explained it away, telling herself that every family had issues, that it wasn't worth creating conflict. But now, with a clearer perspective, she began to see a harder truth. She hadn't been preserving peace. She had been erasing herself to fit into their expectations. The realization didn't come with anger or drama, but with a quiet, unsettling calm. The kind that comes when you finally understand something too clearly to argue with it anymore. She began to imagine the future if nothing changed. More exclusions, more silent dismissals, more family events, where she would exist only as an afterthought. She would become a ghost in her own family, present in name, absent in reality. And beyond the emotional cost, there was also the financial pattern she could no longer ignore. Over the years, her family had treated her income as something accessible, something they could draw from when needed contributions to events. Loans never repaid, expectations disguised as family obligations. She had always agreed, believing it was the price of belonging. But now she saw that, if she continued, those expectations would only grow bigger, more frequent, and more assumed. And so she asked herself a difficult question. Why should she keep paying to stay in a place where she wasn't valued? The answer wasn't simple, because it touched something deeper, the fear of losing her family altogether. But it also opened another possibility, that maybe she didn't need to keep sacrificing herself to maintain an unequal relationship. That night, sitting alone in her apartment, Thora didn't make a final decision. But she did something more important. She stopped justifying what had happened to her. She stopped telling herself it wasn't that bad. She stopped minimizing her own pain. Instead, she allowed herself to acknowledge that she had been hurt and that it was valid. This shift might have been invisible from the outside, but internally, it was a turning point. Because before someone can change their circumstances, They have to change how they see themselves within them. And for the first time in years, Thora no longer saw herself as someone seeking acceptance, but as someone with the right to choose. She hadn't acted yet, hadn't spoken out, but one thing was clear: silence was no longer her only option. Thanksgiving arrived with a coldness that went beyond the late November weather. It reflected the emptiness Thora was facing. She woke up early out of habit like any teacher would, even though there were no classes, no lessons to prepare. Her small apartment was as quiet as always, but that silence felt heavier today, as if it mirrored what she was feeling inside. There were no plans, no alternative invitations, just a long day she had to fill on her own. Thora tried to stay busy. She started by grading papers using work as a way to keep her mind from drifting into painful thoughts. She read each essay carefully, leaving thoughtful feedback, as if doing her job perfectly could help her maintain some control over her emotions. Then she moved on to cleaning, reorganizing her bookshelf, sorting teaching materials, small tasks that created a sense of order in a day when everything inside her felt unsettled. Time moved slowly. Each hour stretched longer than usual, reminding her that this was a day she wasn't supposed to spend alone. By the afternoon, staying busy was no longer enough to cover the emptiness. She prepared a simple meal: microwave turkey, instant mashed potatoes, canned cranberry sauce. Not because she couldn't cook something better, but because she saw no reason to do more for a meal meant for one. She ate standing in the kitchen, not even bothering to sit down, because making it feel like a real dinner would only make the loneliness more obvious. It wasn't a celebration, it was just a way to get through the day. But the moment that truly broke something inside her didn't come during dinner. It came later that evening when her phone lit up. A message from Vivian with a photo attached. "Thanks for understanding. Derek loved dinner. He said our family is so perfect." Thora stared at the image. Her family sat around the table, warm lighting, bright smiles. Her mother at the center, her sister glowing beside her boyfriend, her father quietly smiling. Everything looked perfect, exactly as they wanted it to appear. But what hurt most wasn't her absence. It was the fact that there was no empty seat for her. No sign that she was missing. As if she had never belonged there at all. She looked closer. Small details emerged: the earrings she had given her mother, the dining table their grandmother had passed down, objects that carried her presence but appeared in a picture without her. Her existence remained only in what she had given, not in who she was. It was a strange feeling, both close and distant at the same time. Thora didn't cry, not because she wasn't hurt, but because the pain had moved beyond tears. She simply set her phone down and stared into the quiet. Part of her still wanted to believe things could change, that her family might realize their mistake. But another part, growing stronger, was beginning to accept that this might simply be the truth. And if it was, then she needed to decide how she would live with it. That night as she went to bed, she didn't feel the same sharp pain as before. Instead, she felt emptiness, a quiet space where hope used to be. And within that emptiness, something new began to form. Not resentment, but clarity. A realization that she couldn't continue living the same way. That being excluded from one dinner could just be the beginning, unless she changed how she responded. And for the first time, instead of asking, "Why did they do this?" she began asking a different question. "What am I going to do next?" After that lonely Thanksgiving night, when silence was no longer the easiest option, Thora entered a completely different phase. A phase of awareness and decision. If before she had lived in a state of controlled endurance, now, for the first time, she began questioning the way she had lived for years. The next morning, standing in front of her class, she taught as usual, speaking about historical periods, economic shifts, and social patterns. But beneath her words, her mind was engaged in a different conversation, one about her own life. As she explained to her students how history often repeats itself when people fail to change their behavior, she realized that the same pattern was happening to her. If she continued to stay silent and accept everything, the cycle would never end. Exclusion would become normal. Disrespect would continue. She would always remain on the outside. This realization didn't strike like lightning. It came as a growing clarity, a truth she could no longer ignore. That evening, back in her apartment, Thora didn't try to fill the silence with distractions. Instead, she sat down and began thinking deliberately about her situation. She outlined two clear paths. One was to continue, as she had silent accommodating, maintaining relationships at any cost. The other was to change, set boundaries, and accept the risk of losing the fragile peace she had maintained. Neither path was easy. The first offered familiarity but guaranteed continued pain. The second brought uncertainty and potential conflict, but opened the possibility of being treated with the respect she deserved. This wasn't just a decision about actions, it was a decision about identity. Who would she be in her own story? Someone who constantly yields, or someone who defines her own worth? During this reflection, she thought of Rachel, the one person who knew about the trust. Rachel didn't see the situation as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. She had pointed out the difference between using power as leverage and using it to create accountability. That idea stayed with Thora. Perhaps the question wasn't whether she should use her power, but how she would use it. She didn't want revenge. She didn't want to hurt her family the way they had hurt her. But she also couldn't continue pretending everything was fine. She reopened the email from Margaret Caldwell and read it carefully. This time she wasn't overwhelmed, she was searching for direction. The clauses about authority, conditions, and distribution were no longer distant legal terms. They were practical tools. For the first time, she saw clearly that she not only had power, but also the right to use it fairly. That night, she didn't make a final decision, but she did something more important. She stopped seeing herself as a victim of circumstances. Instead, she began to see herself as someone capable of shaping outcomes. This shift was quiet, not dramatic, but it laid the foundation for everything that would follow. Because when someone moves from endurance to intention, every choice they make carries a different meaning. And even though she didn't yet know exactly what she would do next, one thing was certain: she would not return to being the person who always said, "I understand," without ever being understood. The meeting with attorney Margaret Caldwell marked the first time Thora faced the full reality of the trust her grandmother had left behind, clearly, directly, and without avoidance. Margaret's office wasn't extravagant, but it carried a sense of stability and precision, exactly what Thora needed in that moment: clarity. Sitting across from the woman who had worked with her grandmother for years, Thora was no longer just a granddaughter avoiding responsibility. She was beginning to step into the role of someone managing something far larger than her everyday life. Margaret didn't waste time. She laid out the facts plainly. A trust worth over $15 million. Vivian as the sole beneficiary, and Thora as the sole trustee with complete authority. No board, no secondary oversight. Everything rested in her hands, as long as she acted within her fiduciary duty. When Margaret pointed to the key clause, the authority over timing, amount, and conditions of distribution, Thora understood that this was no longer abstract. This was real power, capable of shaping her sister's future. But what surprised her most wasn't the extent of that power, it was the intention behind it. Margaret shared details of conversations she had with Thora's grandmother, insights Thora had never heard before. The decision hadn't been random. It had been deliberate. Her grandmother believed that only Thora could handle this responsibility fairly. She was concerned that Vivian had grown up without ever having to face consequences, and she wanted the trust to be more than just a financial gift. It was meant to be a lesson. And for that lesson to exist, someone had to be strong enough to say, "Not yet." Someone her grandmother believed Thora to be. Hearing this didn't make Thora feel proud in a conventional way. It made her feel responsible and seen. For the first time, she saw herself through a different lens, not as the undervalued daughter, but as someone trusted with the most important role. It didn't erase the pain of the past, but it reframed it. Perhaps her patience, her resilience, her fairness, qualities she had developed through years of being overlooked, were exactly why she had been chosen. Margaret then outlined Thora's options. She could approve immediate distributions within standard limits, defer them, impose conditions such as financial education or accountability measures, or restructure the distribution entirely. And legally, as long as her decisions were made in good faith, they were nearly unchallengeable. This placed Thora in a position she had never experienced before, where her decisions carried real weight. Yet instead of feeling overwhelmed, she felt grounded. Not because she had all the answers, but because she finally had the right to ask the questions. In her family, she had always reacted, responding to expectations, avoiding conflict. But here, for the first time, she didn't have to react. She could choose. She could decide what was fair, what was right, and what would truly help Vivian grow. As the meeting ended, Margaret handed her an envelope, an invitation to a charity gala she had quietly supported for 2 years. It revealed another layer of truth her family didn't know. Thora wasn't just a modestly paid teacher, she was a meaningful contributor to causes she believed in. The founding donor badge wasn't just a title, it was proof that she had built a different kind of value, one not dependent on her family's recognition. Walking out into the cold air, Thora felt something shift. Not certainty, but direction. She knew where she stood, what she held, and most importantly, that her next decisions would no longer be driven by fear or habit. This wasn't the end of her journey. It was the beginning of finally using her voice. The invitation to the charity gala was not just another social event for Thora. It became a symbolic turning point, where two completely separate worlds in her life were about to collide. On one side was her family, where she had always been seen as not enough. On the other was the world she had quietly built for herself, a world where her value was recognized without the need for display. The irony was that this same gala was also where Vivian and Derek planned to appear, showcasing their place in an elite social circle. For her family, this was a stage of perfection, a place where everything had to look polished and impressive. But what they didn't know was that Thora would also be there, and not as an ordinary guest. For the past 2 years, Thora had supported this foundation, quietly contributing without seeking recognition. She would attend, donate, and leave, avoiding attention, the same kind of judgment she had learned to avoid within her family. But this time would be different. Not because she wanted to prove anything to them, but because she no longer wanted to hide. Looking at the founding donor badge with her name printed clearly, she realized it represented a part of herself her family had never seen and perhaps never wanted to see. In the days leading up to the event, Thora didn't prepare in the typical way. There were no elaborate outfit rehearsals or anxieties about making an impression. What she prepared was her mindset. She knew that stepping into that room meant more than attending an event. It meant facing a new reality. For the first time, she would stand among the very people her family tried so hard to impress. And for the first time, she wouldn't need to apologize for who she was. That realization felt both unfamiliar and liberating. She was no longer standing outside looking in. She was stepping into a space she had once been excluded from. And the most important part was that this shift didn't come from changing herself to fit in, but from realizing she had never needed to. Her value had always existed. It just hadn't been recognized in the environment she came from. The gala, with all its elegance and appearances, would unknowingly become the place where truth could reveal itself. Not through confrontation or argument, but through presence, a presence that could no longer be ignored. Thora understood that she didn't need to say much. Simply showing up as she truly was would be enough to change everything. Meanwhile, her family continued preparing for the evening, as they always had, focused on image, on perception, on making sure everything looked right. They didn't realize that the judgment they feared most was about to come from a place they had never valued. And that lack of awareness would make the moment even more powerful. As the day approached, Thora felt no anxiety, only a quiet calm, as if she were stepping into something that was meant to happen. Not for revenge, not for validation, but to close one chapter and open another. The gala was not just an event. It was the intersection of past and present, between who her family believed she was and who she had truly become. And when those two realities met, there would be no space left for misunderstanding. The moment Thora's family showed up at her apartment door was not a casual visit. It was a complete reversal in how they saw her, at least in that moment. The doorbell rang unexpectedly, and when she looked through the peephole, she immediately sensed something was different. There was no distance, no indifference like before. This time, they came together with purpose. Her mother stepped in almost immediately, carrying urgency, masked as control. Vivian followed, her expression a mix of anger and disbelief, while her father lingered behind in his familiar silence. Then came the confirmation they knew about the trust. Not from Thora, but from an external source, likely a background check, connected to Derek. The secret Thora had held for 2 years was no longer hidden. But what stood out wasn't that they knew, it was how they reacted. There was no acknowledgement of past behavior, no apology for what had happened. Instead, there was an immediate shift toward control, an attempt to redefine the situation in their favor. Her mother spoke about family, about handling things together, about shared responsibility. But beneath those words was a clear message. They wanted control of what Thora had. When she presented prepared documents asking Thora to transfer the trustee role, everything became undeniable. This wasn't a conversation, it was an attempt to take power. And in that moment, something crucial happened. Thora said no. Not angrily, not emotionally, but firmly and clearly. That single word didn't just reject their request. It rejected the entire dynamic they had imposed on her for years. Their reaction was predictable: shock resistance, even attacks. Vivian couldn't accept that the person she had always looked down on now held control over her financial future. Her mother shifted tactics, using emotional pressure, invoking family duty, trying to make Thora feel guilty. But this time it didn't work, because Thora was no longer in the same position. She no longer needed their approval at any cost. She understood her authority, her grandmother's intentions, and most importantly, that standing firm was not selfish, it was responsible. The tension in the room wasn't about raised voices, it was about shifting power. For the first time, Thora wasn't defending herself. She didn't need to explain or justify. She just needed to stand her ground. And that changed everything. When she mentioned the gala as the place to continue the conversation, Vivian's reaction revealed genuine shock. In their minds, Thora didn't belong in those spaces. But that illusion was breaking. When she showed them the founding donor badge, not as a boast but as a fact, the image they had built of her began to crack. That moment wasn't a victory in the traditional sense. It was a shift in perception. For the first time, they were forced to confront a version of Thora they had never acknowledged. When they left, the apartment fell silent again. But it was a different kind of silence. Not empty, but resolved. It marked a boundary crossed. Thora had moved from thinking about change to acting on it. And whatever came next, one thing was certain: she would never return to being the person whose voice carried no weight. If you've ever had to say no to your own family to protect your self-worth, comment, "I chose myself." Because sometimes that's the hardest and most necessary decision you'll ever make. The gala night didn't begin with confrontation. It began with presence. And that presence alone was enough to shift everything. As Thora stepped into the elegant space, the world around her operated by a completely different set of rules than the one she knew within her family. No one there saw her as the lesser daughter. No one viewed her through old assumptions. They saw only what was in front of them: a name on a badge, founding donor. And they treated her accordingly. The contrast was striking. While her family had always defined her by what she lacked here, she was recognized for what she had contributed. Thora didn't try to stand out, nor did she hide. She simply existed in that space, speaking, listening, participating naturally. And that authenticity made her presence more powerful, because it wasn't performance, it was truth. When Derek first noticed her, what drew his attention wasn't family connection, but her status in that room. He recognized the badge, understood its significance, and approached her with respect. The moment he introduced himself was when the two worlds began to intersect. When she said her name, Mitchell, the connection formed instantly, and just as quickly the gap between what he had been told and what he was seeing became undeniable. Vivian, standing beside him, could no longer control the narrative. The image she had carefully constructed began to crack. Without Thora saying anything negative, her very presence raised questions. Why had someone with this status never been mentioned? Why had she been excluded? These questions didn't need to be spoken. They were visible in Derek's shifting expression and his growing awareness. As others nearby began to notice, the moment expanded beyond a private exchange. It became public not through intention, but because truth once visible cannot remain hidden in a room built on observation. Margaret Caldwell's arrival reinforced that reality. When she acknowledged Thora's role as trustee, the final pieces fell into place. What had been fragments became a complete picture, one that directly contradicted what Vivian had presented. This moment wasn't loud. There were no accusations, no dramatic arguments, but that calmness made it more powerful. Because truth revealed without force carries a deeper weight than any confrontation. Derek didn't need further proof. He had seen enough to understand that something significant had been hidden from him. And that realization didn't just change how he saw Thora, it changed how he saw Vivian. For Thora, this moment wasn't about proving anything to her family. She didn't come to expose them, or to seek validation, but as it unfolded, she realized that once she stopped hiding, the truth naturally revealed itself. And that was the real shift, not how others saw her, but how she allowed herself to be seen. As she stepped away from the conversation, leaving behind questions and shifting perceptions, she didn't feel victorious in the usual sense. She felt lighter, like a burden had been lifted. Not because everything was resolved, but because she no longer had to carry a diminished version of herself to fit into someone else's expectations. And in a room built on appearances, her authenticity became the most powerful presence of all. After the moment at the gala, when the truth could no longer be hidden, the consequences didn't explode instantly. They unfolded gradually like ripples spreading outward, subtle yet irreversible. For Vivian, the first shift wasn't external. It was how she was perceived. In an environment where image and transparency carry equal weight, hiding critical information is not a small detail. Derek, who approached life with clarity and calculation, began to reassess their relationship from a new perspective. The absolute trust that once existed was replaced by pause, a step back, to evaluate. This wasn't expressed through dramatic arguments, but through distance and silent signals often louder than words. For Thora's family, especially her mother, the shift was harder to accept. For years, she had controlled the narrative, defining who was successful, who was worthy of pride. But now, that narrative had been disrupted in a space she couldn't control. People who had heard her version of the family now had another perspective, one that couldn't easily be dismissed. This created a social pressure that couldn't be resolved with explanations alone. Thora, once seen as the lesser daughter, had become the center of a shift no one had prepared for. Yet what stood out was that she didn't use this moment to attack or humiliate them further. After stepping away from the conversation, she chose distance, not prolonging the conflict, not trying to control others' reactions. This wasn't avoidance, but intention, allowing others to face what had happened without interference. This calm approach made a significant difference. Instead of turning the situation into a battle, she allowed it to become a turning point. In the days that followed, changes became clearer. Vivian and Derek's relationship was no longer stable. Plans built on perfection began to weaken when their foundation was questioned. Meanwhile, Thora's family began to confront a reality they had long avoided, that their treatment of her was no longer invisible. It had become something others could see and judge. This forced them to reconsider, not necessarily out of immediate change, but because they could no longer maintain the same behavior without consequences. For Thora, this phase didn't feel like victory, it felt like transition. She didn't need to prove anything further, because what needed to be seen had already been seen. Instead, she focused on maintaining what she had begun: clarity, boundaries, and self-defined value. The most important shift wasn't how others reacted, but that she didn't return to who she used to be. The change wasn't perfect, and it wasn't immediate, but it was real. And once truth is brought into the light, no one can fully return to what existed before. After the consequences of the gala began to unfold, Thora entered the most important phase, not reacting to what had happened, but making intentional decisions about how to use the power she held. Her follow-up meeting with attorney Margaret Caldwell was no longer about understanding, it was about action. Every option now needed to be translated into a clear decision. Thora didn't arrive driven by emotion or influenced by recent events. She came with calm clarity, a state where she was no longer seeking validation, but focusing on doing what was right. When Margaret asked about her decision, Thora paused. She reflected briefly on everything she had experienced: years of being overlooked, the Thanksgiving exclusion, the moment at the gala. But instead of letting those emotions guide her, she returned to her grandmother's original intention: not punishment, but growth. From that perspective, she made her first decision to defer the distribution of the trust for 12 months. This wasn't retaliation, but a necessary pause to allow for meaningful change. Thora understood that if the money were given immediately, nothing would shift. Vivian would have no reason to reflect, and the lesson her grandmother intended would never take place. But delay alone wasn't enough. Thora added a condition: Vivian must complete a certified financial management course before accessing the funds. This wasn't a punishment, it was a standard. A way to ensure that the beneficiary could understand and manage what she was receiving. Margaret confirmed that this decision was fully within Thora's authority and aligned with the trust's structure. This validation reinforced Thora's confidence. But she didn't stop there. She made another decision, one focused on transparency. She wanted Derek to be fully informed about the trust and its structure, not to influence their relationship, but to ensure that any future decisions would be based on truth. This reflected a critical distinction in how Thora used her power not to control others, but to create an environment of clarity and accountability. As the decisions were formalized, Thora didn't feel instant relief, but she felt certainty. For the first time, she wasn't just aware of her power, she was using it in a way that reflected her values: fairness, responsibility, and independence from emotional impulse. What stood out most was that she wasn't trying to win. She wasn't trying to make Vivian fail or force her family to apologize. Instead, she focused on creating a structure where each person had to face their own choices. And that is where true change begins. Because power, when used correctly, is not about control. It is about setting the boundaries necessary for growth. As she left the attorney's office, Thora was no longer reacting to her past. She was shaping her future. And while the path ahead might still be complex, she had established one essential truth: she would never again allow her value to depend on how others chose to treat her. After Thora's decisions were formalized, the consequences that followed were no longer just personal or emotional. They began to ripple through the very structure of each family member's life. What stood out was that there was no dramatic explosion. No public arguments, no direct accusations. Instead, it was the quiet shifts that created the deepest impact. For Vivian, the deferral of the trust and its conditions were not just financial obstacles, they forced her to reevaluate herself. For the first time, she couldn't rely on expectation or privilege to get what she wanted. She had to face a clear requirement: learn, prove, and accept that some things couldn't be obtained instantly. This disrupted the system she had always depended on, forcing her into unfamiliar territory. At the same time, her relationship with Derek continued to be affected by what had happened at the gala. Trust, once questioned, cannot be easily restored with explanations. Derek didn't respond with anger, but with caution, a deliberate distance, to reassess everything. This forced Vivian to face something new. She could no longer control how she was perceived. For Thora's mother, the shift occurred on a social level. For years, she had built her identity around the image of her family. But after the gala, that narrative was no longer entirely hers to control. People who had once heard her version now had another perspective, and that created a pressure she couldn't manage with words alone. This loss of control didn't manifest as immediate collapse, but as subtle changes: different tones in conversations, unspoken questions, shifting perceptions. For Thora's father, the situation created space for self-reflection. Having always stood on the sidelines, he now had to confront his role, not through blame, but through clarity. When everything was exposed, his silence was no longer neutral. It became part of the problem. This created an internal pressure, forcing him to reconsider his choices over the years. For Thora, this phase didn't feel like control or victory, it felt like a new kind of stability. She no longer needed to track every reaction or adjust her behavior to fit others. What she had done, set boundaries, define conditions, stand firm, was enough to initiate change. Instead of interfering further, she chose distance, allowing things to unfold naturally. This wasn't indifference, it was understanding that not everything requires direct control. One of the most important shifts was how Thora saw herself. She no longer viewed herself as the center of conflict, but as someone who had made a necessary choice. This distinction allowed her to remain balanced, neither pulled into negativity nor returning to her old role. And that stability became the foundation for what came next. Because when a system begins to change, what matters most isn't immediate reaction, but the ability to sustain that change over time. And for the first time, Thora wasn't just starting change, she was holding it. After the quiet but profound shifts, change in Thora's family didn't come in the form of perfect apologies or dramatic gestures. It began with small signs, things that once seemed impossible. The most noticeable and unexpected change came from her father. For years, he had remained on the sidelines, neither opposing nor defending, existing as a neutral presence in every conflict. But after everything that had happened, that position was no longer sustainable. For the first time, he reached out, not with short messages, but with a long letter. In it, he didn't justify his silence or minimize his responsibility. He acknowledged that he had seen the unfairness Thora endured, and that his inaction made him part of the problem. What mattered wasn't just the apology, but the fact that he finally named the truth. For Thora, reading his words didn't bring instant closure, but it shifted something. Their relationship was no longer an unreachable void. It became something that could potentially be rebuilt slowly and imperfectly. When he visited her apartment near Christmas, the change wasn't in grand words, but in how he showed up, observing, listening, being present in a new way. He saw her space, a place he had never entered before, and realized her life wasn't lesser. It was simply different. The dinner she prepared wasn't elaborate, but it was meaningful. There was no pressure to impress, just genuine connection. In that setting, his presence was no longer silent. It was intentional, even if subtle. For her mother, change was slower and more complex. She didn't easily let go of old perspectives, but the pressure from recent events forced her to adjust, at least in how she approached Thora. Her calls were less demanding, more cautious, as if she were trying to find a new way to connect. However, Thora didn't rush to respond. She understood that real change isn't measured by words in a short time, but by consistent actions. So she chose to keep her distance, not as punishment, but as protection. For Vivian, change took a different form, not immediate acknowledgement, but small steps of adaptation. Enrolling in a financial management course wasn't emotional, it was practical, yet it held deeper meaning. For the first time, she had to do something, not because she wanted to, but because it was required. The short message she sent, Thora carried no apology or warmth, but it contained something important she was trying in her own way. For Thora, all these changes didn't create a clear ending. They opened a new phase. She no longer sought a perfect family, nor expected things to return to the past. Instead, she accepted that relationships could change shape, as long as they were built on respect and honesty. What mattered most was that she didn't lose what she had gained: her boundaries, her clarity, and her right to choose how she participates in her family's life. And from that foundation, any future connection would mean more, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. After everything that happened, Thora didn't find a perfect ending. She found a new kind of balance, a way of living she had never imagined possible. Her life didn't transform in a dramatic or glamorous way. She was still a teacher, still waking up early, grading papers, standing in front of her classroom, doing the work she believed mattered. But the difference was in how she moved through each day. She no longer carried the need to prove her worth to her family, nor did she wait for their validation to feel enough. This shift didn't come from external circumstances becoming perfect. It came from changing how she saw herself. She realized her value was not dependent on others' opinions, and that setting boundaries was not about hurting others but protecting herself. Her family relationships still existed, but they no longer defined her. She chose when to engage and when to step back, and those choices came from clarity, not obligation. This didn't make her distant. It made her more authentic. When she connected with others, friends, colleagues, even family, it was from willingness, not pressure. Her decision to join the Foundation's advisory council reflected that same alignment. It wasn't about status, but about continuing what she believed in: contributing, educating, making a difference. It showed that while her circumstances had shifted, her core values remained the same. She didn't need to become someone else to be accepted. She had already accepted herself, and that acceptance became a stronger foundation than any external recognition. Looking back, Thora felt no regret, not because everything went perfectly, but because she acted in alignment with who she truly was. She didn't destroy her family. She simply refused to continue existing in an unfair dynamic. And sometimes that is the hardest thing to do. This transformation didn't make her life perfect, but it made her the author of her own story. And when someone reaches that point, they are no longer defined by what happened to them, but by how they choose to respond. It wasn't a loud victory. It was a quiet freedom, the kind that comes from knowing who you are and no longer being willing to trade that for acceptance. If you're learning to set boundaries and choose yourself, comment "I am enough," because that journey isn't easy, but it's worth everything. Thora's story doesn't end with a dramatic moment or a perfect reconciliation. It closes in a more honest way by accepting that not every relationship needs to return to what it was in order to have meaning. Her family still exists. The connections are still there, but they are no longer built on silence and one-sided sacrifice. Thora didn't change them through force or by proving anything. She changed the dynamic by changing how she showed up. And sometimes when one person changes, the entire system has no choice but to adjust. The most important realization she gained was that her value is not something granted by others. It doesn't come from praise recognition or fitting into someone else's standards. It comes from knowing who she is, what she stands for, and being willing to protect that. When she stopped trying to become the version her family expected, she finally became the strongest version of herself. What happened wasn't a revenge story, but a journey of awareness from accepting being overlooked to defining her own worth. And that journey didn't just change her relationship with her family, it changed how she moved through the world. She no longer feared judgment because she no longer needed to fit into expectations that weren't hers. She no longer feared losing acceptance because she had found it within herself. This didn't make life perfect, but it made it real. And truth, even when uncomfortable, is the strongest foundation any relationship can have. If there is one message this story leaves behind, it's not that you must confront or cut people off, it's that you have the right to choose how you are treated. You have the right to say enough when your boundaries are crossed, and to build a life where your value is not questioned. Thora didn't become someone else. She simply became herself, and that was enough to change everything. In the end, this story isn't just hers. It belongs to anyone who has ever felt unseen within their own family. And if you are on that journey, remember, change doesn't start with others. It starts the moment you stop accepting what no longer aligns with you. If this story made you think, leave a like and hit subscribe so you don't miss what's next, because sometimes one story can change how you see your entire life. Maintaining the habit of regular health checkups is one of the most proactive and effective ways to protect yourself from potential health risks. Many people only visit a doctor when clear symptoms appear, but in reality, many serious conditions, such as cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, cancer, or metabolic disorders, often develop silently over a long period without obvious signs. Regular health checkups help detect abnormalities, early allowing timely intervention, reducing risks, and lowering treatment costs in the long run. In general, individuals should undergo a comprehensive health check at least once or twice a year, depending on their age, medical history, and lifestyle. A basic checkup package may include blood tests, blood pressure measurement, liver and kidney function tests, blood sugar, and cholesterol levels. Additionally, depending on gender and age, more specialized screenings such as cancer screening, cardiovascular examinations, or hormonal assessments may be necessary. Beyond disease detection, health checkups also help you better understand your body's condition, enabling you to adjust your diet, daily habits, and physical activity accordingly. For example, if your results show a high risk of cholesterol or blood sugar issues, you can modify your diet and increase exercise to improve these indicators. Another important benefit of regular checkups is peace of mind. Knowing that your body is stable or well managed can reduce anxiety and motivate you to maintain a healthy lifestyle. To build this habit, you can schedule a fixed checkup time each year, set reminders on your phone, or go with family members for encouragement. Think of regular health checkups as an investment in your future, because early detection is always the key to living a healthier and longer life. Drinking enough water is one of the simplest habits that can have a powerful impact on your overall health. The human body is made up of about 60–70% water, so maintaining proper hydration helps your organs function smoothly and efficiently. Water plays a crucial role in regulating body temperature, supporting digestion, transporting nutrients, and removing toxins from the body. When you are dehydrated, you may feel tired, experience headaches, dizziness, and have difficulty concentrating. In the long term, lack of water can also affect your skin, making it dry, dull, and more prone to aging. To stay healthy, you should aim to drink about 1.5 to 2 liters of water per day, depending on your body weight and activity level. In addition to plain water, you can also get fluids from fruits, vegetables, and natural sugar-free juices. A helpful tip is to drink water right after waking up. Carry a water bottle with you and take small sips throughout the day, instead of waiting until you feel thirsty. By maintaining the habit of drinking enough water daily, you not only improve your physical health, but also boost your mental well-being and productivity. Daily physical activity is a key factor in maintaining a healthy body and a positive mindset. In modern life, many people spend most of their time sitting at work or using phones and computers, which leads to a sedentary lifestyle and sluggishness. Building a habit of exercising for at least 20-30 minutes a day can improve cardiovascular health, enhance blood circulation, and support better respiratory function. Moreover, physical activity helps the body release endorphins, hormones that create feelings of happiness, thereby reducing stress and significantly improving mood. You don't need intense workouts or a daily gym routine. Simple activities like brisk walking, light jogging, cycling, jumping rope, or practicing yoga at home are enough. The most important thing is consistency over time. Additionally, you can make use of small moments during the day, such as taking the stairs instead of the elevator, standing up to move after each hour of work, or walking after meals. These small changes can make a big difference in the long run. When your body stays active regularly, you will feel more energetic, sleep better, and perform more effectively at work. This habit forms a strong foundation for a healthy and sustainable lifestyle. Healthy eating is a fundamental foundation for maintaining long-term health and preventing many diseases. The food you consume daily not only provides energy, but also directly affects your immune system, cardiovascular health, and even your mental well-being. A balanced diet should include all essential nutrients, such as protein, healthy carbohydrates, good fats, vitamins, and minerals. You should prioritize natural foods like green vegetables, fresh fruits, whole grains, fish, lean meats, and nuts. At the same time, limit fast food, processed foods, fried items, and sugary drinks, as they can increase the risk of obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. In addition to food choices, eating habits also play an important role. Try to eat at regular times, avoid skipping meals, especially breakfast, and control portion sizes appropriately. Eating slowly and chewing thoroughly not only improves digestion, but also helps you recognize when you are full, preventing overeating. Furthermore, cooking at home is an effective way to control the quality and nutritional value of your meals. By maintaining a healthy diet, your body receives the nutrients it needs, helping you feel more energetic, stay healthier, and reduce the risk of chronic illnesses. Getting enough sleep is an essential factor in helping the body recover and maintain overall health. During sleep, the body carries out many important processes, such as cell regeneration, hormone balance, and strengthening the immune system. If you regularly lack sleep, you may feel tired, experience memory decline, have difficulty concentrating, and become more irritable. In the long term, insufficient sleep can increase the risk of conditions such as cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and mental health disorders. Adults should aim for 7-8 hours of sleep each night to ensure proper rest. To improve sleep quality, try to maintain a consistent sleep and wake schedule every day, even on weekends. Additionally, limit the use of phones or electronic devices before bedtime, as blue light can interfere with melatonin, the hormone that helps regulate sleep. Creating a quiet, cool, and comfortable sleeping environment can also help you sleep better. You can relax by reading a light book, listening to soothing music, or practicing meditation before going to bed. With quality sleep, you will wake up feeling refreshed, energized, and ready to take on a productive new day. Maintaining a positive mindset is one of the most important, yet often overlooked factors when it comes to overall health. Many people focus only on diet and physical exercise, forgetting that mental well-being has a profound impact on the body. When you maintain positive thoughts, your body responds in beneficial ways, helping to reduce stress